I never thought a basement could smell like vengeance, but that's exactly what 3 feet of stagnant water smells like when it ruins everything you own. My name is Tyler Lawson, and I'm a software engineer who bought a modest ranch house in Pinecrest Meadows, a subdivision just outside Charlotte, North Carolina, about 18 months ago. It was supposed to be my fresh start after my divorce, a place where I could rebuild my life in peace. Instead, it became ground zero for the most insane HOA battle I could have ever imagined. The whole nightmare started on a Tuesday morning in late March. I'd been working from home, sitting at my desk on a video call with my team, when I heard this weird gurgling sound coming from downstairs. At first, I thought maybe the washing machine was acting up, but then I heard something that made my blood run cold, the unmistakable sound of rushing water. I ended the call immediately and bolted down the basement stairs. What I saw made me want to vomit. Water was literally gushing up through the floor drain like a geyser, flooding my entire basement at an alarming rate. My storage boxes were already floating, my tools were submerged, and the water level was rising by the second. I waded through the freezing water to the main shutoff valve, but turning off my water did absolutely nothing. The water kept coming. That's when I realized this wasn't coming from my pipes at all. This was coming from outside. I called emergency plumbing services, and within an hour, a guy named Rick showed up with his equipment. He was in his 50s, weathered face, and the kind of person who had seen everything in 30 years of plumbing work. He spent about 20 minutes investigating before he came back upstairs with the worst news possible. "Your floor drain is connected to the storm drain system," Rick explained, wiping his hands on a rag. "And from what I can see, there's a massive amount of water being diverted directly into the line that feeds into your basement. This isn't an accident, Mr. Lawson. Someone deliberately rerouted storm drainage to flow right into your property." "That's insane," I said. "Who would do that?" Rick shrugged. "I don't know, but you need to call the county and probably a lawyer. This is intentional property damage. In the meantime, I can set up some pumps to get this water out. But if they don't fix whatever they did to the storm drains, you're just going to flood again the next time it rains." Over the next several hours, Rick and his assistant set up industrial pumps and started clearing the water. The damage was catastrophic. Thousands of dollars worth of my belongings were destroyed, my finished basement was ruined, and I was looking at massive mold remediation costs. While the pumps ran, I started making calls. The county's stormwater management department said they would send an inspector out within a week. A week. My insurance company informed me that flooding from external sources might not be covered under my standard homeowner's policy, and when I called a lawyer, I was told that establishing liability could take months or even years. I felt completely powerless until I remembered something. 3 months ago, the HOA had sent out a notice about some drainage improvement project they were doing in the neighborhood. At the time, I had barely paid attention because the work was supposedly happening on the other side of the subdivision, nowhere near my property. I pulled up my email and found the notice. It was from Brenda Donnelly, the HOA president, and it vaguely mentioned infrastructure improvements to enhance neighborhood drainage efficiency. The notice required homeowner approval, and I had signed off on it along with everyone else, assuming it was routine maintenance. The next morning, after a sleepless night listening to pumps running and wondering if my basement would flood again, I decided to do some investigating. I walked around my property, trying to trace where the water might be coming from. My house sat on a slight downward slope, which had never been a problem before. But when I walked up toward the main road, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. There was a new concrete drainage channel, partially hidden by landscaping, that ran along the edge of several properties before disappearing underground right at my property line. I followed it back up the street and discovered it originated from a large retention pond area that served the entire upper section of Pinecrest Meadows. The retention pond had been there since the subdivision was built, but the drainage system was clearly new, and it was directing every drop of stormwater runoff from approximately 40 homes straight toward my property, where it was apparently being channeled directly into my basement through the storm drain system. I took photos of everything and then decided it was time to confront the HOA directly. The association office was located in a small building near the subdivision entrance, staffed 3 days a week by Brenda herself. It was Wednesday, one of her office days, so I drove over there with my evidence. Brenda Donnelly was exactly what you'd picture when you imagine an overbearing HOA president. She was in her early 50s, with an aggressive blonde bob haircut and the kind of pursed lips that suggested she had spent decades perfecting her disapproving expression. She wore a crisp white blouse and had reading glasses hanging on a chain around her neck. "Mr. Lawson," she said when I walked in, not bothering to look up from her computer, "I don't have you on my schedule today." "That's because this is an emergency," I said, keeping my voice level. "My basement flooded yesterday with several feet of water. The plumber traced it to storm drains that were deliberately rerouted into my property. I have photos of new drainage infrastructure that appears to be connected to the HOA's recent project." That got her attention. She finally looked at me, but her expression wasn't concerned. It was annoyed. "I'm aware of the situation with your basement," she said coldly. "Your property has always had drainage issues. That's not the HOA's responsibility." "My property never had drainage issues until 3 weeks ago when your construction crew finished their work," I shot back. "And my plumber confirmed that someone deliberately connected storm drains to the system that flows into my basement. That's not a coincidence." Brenda leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. "Mr. Lawson, the drainage improvements were approved by the homeowners, including you. The project was designed by a licensed civil engineer to improve water management for the entire neighborhood. If your property is experiencing drainage problems, that's because your house has a design flaw, not because of anything the HOA did." "That's complete garbage, and you know it," I said, feeling my anger rising. "I want to see the engineering plans for this project. I want to know exactly what was done and why water is now flooding my basement." "Those documents are proprietary HOA property," Brenda said with a tight smile, "and I don't appreciate your tone. If you have concerns, you're welcome to submit them in writing at our next monthly board meeting, which is 3 weeks from now." 3 weeks? My basement is currently being pumped out by industrial equipment. I've lost thousands of dollars in property. I need answers now, not in 3 weeks. Brenda stood up, signaling the conversation was over. "Mr. Lawson, I understand you're upset, but making demands and accusations isn't going to help your situation. The HOA acted in accordance with all applicable regulations. If you have property damage, that's what homeowners insurance is for. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." I left that office shaking with rage. She had basically admitted they knew about my flooding, but refused to take any responsibility. Worse, she was stonewalling me from accessing any information about what they had actually done. When I got home, the pumps had finally cleared most of the water. Rick's assistant was packing up equipment when I arrived. "Got most of it out," he told me, "but you're going to need serious remediation work. And like my boss said, this is going to happen again unless they fix whatever they did to those drains." He was absolutely right. 2 days later, we got a spring thunderstorm, typical for North Carolina in late March. It rained for about 3 hours, not even a particularly heavy storm. And sure enough, water came flooding back into my basement through that floor drain. This time I was ready with my own pumps, but it didn't matter. I was fighting a losing battle against an entire neighborhood's worth of stormwater runoff. I spent the weekend documenting everything, taking videos of the water coming up through the drain, photographing the water level, and tracking exactly how much rainfall we got versus how much flooding occurred. I also started doing research on property law and HOA liability. What I discovered was disturbing. HOAs in North Carolina have broad authority to make infrastructure changes, and as long as they follow proper procedures and get homeowner approval, they're largely protected from liability. However, if they knowingly caused property damage through negligence or intentional misconduct, that was a different story. The problem was proving it. I needed those engineering documents. I needed to show that they had deliberately designed the system to drain water onto my property, or at least that they knew it would cause this problem and did it anyway. On Monday, I filed a formal written complaint with the HOA board requesting access to all engineering plans, permits, and communications related to the drainage project. I also filed a complaint with the county requesting an emergency inspection, and I contacted 3 different attorneys to see who might take my case. The county inspector finally showed up on Thursday, a week after my initial flooding. His name was Marcus, a middle-aged man with a county badge and a clipboard who spent about 2 hours examining my property and the drainage system. "This is bad," he told me when he finished. "Real bad. Someone definitely rerouted a major stormwater flow to discharge on your property. That's a violation of county codes. Stormwater is supposed to be managed through proper retention and gradual discharge, not dumped onto residential properties." "Can you make them fix it?" I asked, feeling a glimmer of hope. Marcus frowned. "I can issue a violation notice to the HOA and require them to submit a remediation plan. But enforcement can take time, especially if they fight it. These HOA cases can drag on for months while lawyers argue about who's responsible for what. So what am I supposed to do in the meantime? Just let my basement flood every time it rains?" "Document everything," Marcus advised. "Keep records of every flooding incident, every dollar you spend on repairs and pumping. That's going to be important if this goes to court. I'll do my part with the county, but you should definitely get a lawyer." After he left, I finally heard back from one of the attorneys I had contacted. Her name was Patricia, and she specialized in property disputes and HOA cases. We had a consultation call that afternoon. "From what you're describing, you have a strong case for property damage and negligence," Patricia told me. "But litigation is expensive and time-consuming. Before we go that route, I recommend sending a formal demand letter to the HOA, laying out exactly what happened and what you want them to do about it. Sometimes that's enough to get them to the negotiating table." "And if it's not enough?" I asked. "Then we file a lawsuit and probably seek an emergency injunction to force them to stop the drainage while the case proceeds. But that's going to cost you probably $10,000 just to start, with no guarantee of how long it takes or what the outcome will be." I didn't have $10,000 lying around, especially after the costs I was already incurring from the flooding damage. But I authorized Patricia to send the demand letter, hoping that might shake something loose. The letter went out the next day, formally demanding that the HOA immediately cease directing stormwater onto my property, pay for all damages incurred, and provide access to all engineering documents related to the project. We gave them 7 days to respond. The response came in 6 days from the HOA's attorney. It was a masterpiece of legal deflection. They denied any wrongdoing, claimed that their drainage project was properly designed and permitted, and suggested that my flooding problems were due to pre-existing conditions with the subject property. They refused to provide any documents or accept any liability. Patricia called me after receiving their response. "This is pretty standard stonewalling. They're banking on you not being able to afford a prolonged legal battle. The question is, what do you want to do?" I was at a breaking point. The flooding was continuing. I had already spent over $5,000 on pumps, emergency plumbing, and temporary repairs. My homeowner's insurance had denied my claim, stating that the damage was due to surface water flooding, which wasn't covered under my policy. And now, I was looking at either accepting the destruction of my property or going into serious debt to fight the HOA in court. That's when I made a decision that probably wasn't smart, but felt absolutely necessary. If the HOA was going to direct stormwater onto my property and hide behind lawyers and bureaucracy, then I was going to show them exactly what it felt like. I spent the entire weekend researching and planning. I studied the subdivision layout, property lines, and most importantly, the drainage patterns. Brenda Donnelly's house was in the upper section of Pinecrest Meadows, one of the larger homes on a corner lot. Her property sat on high ground, which was exactly why she probably didn't care about flooding issues. Water naturally flowed away from her house. But here's the thing about water. It goes where you direct it. And I was pretty good at problem solving. That's what I did for a living, just usually with code instead of plumbing. I called Rick, my plumber, and asked him a hypothetical question. If someone wanted to redirect water from one property to another, how would they do it? Rick was quiet for a moment. "Are we talking theoretically here, or are you planning something?" "Completely theoretical," I lied. "Well, theoretically, you'd need to change the grade and slope of the land, install some drainage channels or pipes, and direct the water where you want it to go. It's not that complicated if you know what you're doing. Why?" "Just curious about how the HOA did what they did to me," I said. Over the next week, I worked at night, after dark, when neighbors were unlikely to notice what I was doing. I bought about 200 feet of heavy-duty drainage pipe, along with several redirectors and connection fittings. I also purchased a small trenching tool and a lot of dirt and mulch to cover my work. My property line backed up to a common area that ran behind several houses, including a portion that eventually curved around toward the street where Brenda lived. It wasn't a direct line, but water doesn't need a direct line. It just needs a path. The first night, I started trenching a shallow channel along the edge of my property, right at the tree line where it wouldn't be immediately visible. I connected this to the output from my sump pumps, which were now running constantly to keep my basement from flooding. The second night, I extended the trench through the common area, carefully following the natural contours of the land. I installed the drainage pipe in sections, making sure everything sloped correctly for water to flow. The third night was the tricky part. I had to get the pipe close enough to Brenda's property that the water would naturally flow into her yard. Her property had a decorative drainage swale along one side, designed to look attractive while channeling away any rare water that might come her direction. It was perfect for my purposes. I connected my pipe system to discharge right at the top of her swale. When water came through my system now, it would pour out onto the high ground above her property and follow the swale right through her yard, across her perfect landscaping, and down toward the lower properties on the other side of her house. The whole installation took me 5 nights of careful work. I camouflaged everything with mulch, leaves, and careful landscaping. Unless someone was specifically looking for it, the pipe system was invisible. Then I waited for rain. It came 3 days later, another typical spring storm. As water started flooding into my basement, my pumps kicked on automatically, just like they had been doing for weeks. But now, instead of just pumping water out onto my yard where it would partially drain away, the pumps were sending it through my new pipe system. I actually drove over to Brenda's street to watch, parking a few houses down where I could see her property. Within about 30 minutes of steady rain, water started pouring out of my discharge pipe into her swale. At first, it probably looked natural, just stormwater doing what stormwater does. But as my pumps kept running, the flow increased to a torrent. Water cascaded through Brenda's yard, overwhelming the decorative swale and spreading across her perfect lawn. It pooled around her foundation, flooded her flower beds, and turned her landscaping into a muddy swamp. I watched as her outdoor lighting fixtures were submerged, as water eroded the mulch from her gardens, and as her backyard became a small lake. I probably should have felt guilty. Instead, I felt satisfaction. This was exactly what had been happening to my property for weeks, and now she was getting a taste of her own medicine. The next morning, I got a phone call from an unknown number. I answered and was greeted by Brenda's voice, shaking with rage. "What did you do?" she screamed into the phone. "My yard is destroyed. There's water everywhere. I know this was you." "I have no idea what you're talking about," I said calmly. "Is there a problem with your property?" "Don't play dumb with me, Tyler. My entire yard flooded last night. This has never happened before. You did something." "That's a serious accusation," I replied. "Do you have any evidence? Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're experiencing drainage problems. You know, like the drainage problems I've been having since your construction project. The ones you said weren't the HOA's responsibility." "This is completely different," Brenda sputtered. "Someone deliberately flooded my property." "Did they?" I asked innocently. "Or does your property just have design flaws? Maybe you should check with your insurance company. That's what you told me to do, remember?" "I'm calling the police," Brenda threatened, "and the county, and a lawyer. You're not going to get away with this." "Good luck with that," I said, and hung up. I knew I was taking a risk. What I had done was probably illegal, definitely against HOA rules, and could potentially get me in serious trouble. But I was betting that Brenda wouldn't want to draw too much attention to the situation, because any investigation into water drainage would inevitably circle back to what the HOA had done to my property first. It rained again 2 days later, and again, my pumps kicked on, sending water through my pipe system and flooding Brenda's yard. This time, I heard through neighborhood gossip that water had actually gotten into her basement through a window well. The irony was absolutely delicious. After the second flooding, I got a certified letter from the HOA demanding I appear at an emergency board meeting to address illegal water discharge onto common areas and other homeowner properties. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. I showed up with Patricia, my attorney, and a folder full of documentation about my own flooding issues. The meeting was held in the community center, and about 20 residents were there, including all 5 board members. Brenda sat at the head of the table, looking like she wanted to murder me. "Mr. Lawson," she began, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "The HOA has received complaints about water discharge from your property that is causing damage to common areas and to the property of Board President Brenda Donnelly. This is a serious violation of community covenants, and we are considering immediate legal action." Patricia stood up before I could respond. "Before we discuss any alleged violations by my client, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Mr. Lawson's property has been experiencing severe flooding for over a month due to stormwater drainage that was deliberately rerouted by the HOA's recent construction project. We have plumber reports, county inspector reports, and extensive documentation of this damage." One of the other board members, a man named Frank, shifted uncomfortably. "The drainage project was designed by a professional engineer. It shouldn't have caused any problems." "And yet it did," Patricia said sharply. "It caused extensive damage to my client's property, damage that the HOA has refused to address or even acknowledge. The county has already issued a violation notice for improper stormwater management. So before you accuse Mr. Lawson of anything, you might want to consider your own liability here." Brenda's face was turning red. "That's completely separate from what Tyler has done. 2 wrongs don't make a right." "You're absolutely correct," I said, speaking up for the first time. 2 wrongs don't make a right, but you know what does make a right? Fixing the problem you caused in the first place. If stormwater wasn't flooding my basement every time it rains, I wouldn't need to run pumps constantly. And if I'm not running pumps, then water isn't being discharged from my property." "So you admit you're deliberately flooding my yard?" Brenda practically shouted. "I admit that I'm pumping water out of my basement to prevent catastrophic damage to my home," I said carefully. "Where that water goes after it leaves my property isn't something I can control. Water flows downhill, Brenda. You of all people should understand that, since your drainage project was designed to flow water onto my property." Another board member, a woman named Susan, spoke up. "Is it true that the county issued a violation notice?" "Yes," Patricia confirmed. "The county stormwater inspector determined that the HOA's drainage system is in violation of county codes because it directs concentrated stormwater discharge onto a residential property without proper retention or mitigation. The county has ordered the HOA to submit a remediation plan within 30 days. This was news to most of the board members, I could tell. Brenda had apparently kept that information to herself. Frank turned to Brenda with a confused expression. "You didn't tell us about a county violation," he said. "It's being handled," Brenda said dismissively. "Our attorney is dealing with it." "By dealing with it, you mean stonewalling and denying responsibility while my client's property is destroyed?" Patricia asked. "Because that's not going to work. We're prepared to file a lawsuit for property damage, negligence, and intentional misconduct. And we're going to seek an immediate injunction to force the HOA to fix the drainage system while the litigation proceeds." The room got very quiet. I could see the other board members doing mental math about legal costs and potential liability. HOAs run on assessment fees from homeowners, and a lawsuit could mean special assessments or increased fees for everyone. A man at the back of the room raised his hand. "I'm sorry, but I'm just a homeowner trying to understand what's going on. Are you saying the HOA broke something that's flooding this gentleman's house, and now they're trying to blame him for trying to protect his property?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Patricia confirmed. "That's not what happened at all," Brenda insisted. "The drainage project was done properly. Tyler's house has underlying issues that aren't the HOA's fault." "Then you won't mind providing the engineering plans and permit documents to prove that," Patricia said. "We've requested those documents multiple times and you've refused. That's called spoliation, and it doesn't look good for your case." Frank cleared his throat. "Brenda, I think we need to have a board discussion about this. This is the first time most of us are hearing about county violations and potential lawsuits. Maybe we should adjourn and reconvene after we've had a chance to consult with the HOA attorney." "I agree," Susan said quickly. Several other board members nodded. Brenda looked like she wanted to argue, but she was outnumbered. "Fine. This meeting is adjourned. We'll reconvene next week." As people filed out, several homeowners came up to me to ask questions or express support. Apparently, I wasn't the only person who had issues with Brenda's authoritarian management style. One couple told me they had been fighting with the HOA for 6 months over a fence dispute. Another man said Brenda had threatened to fine him because his mailbox was the wrong shade of black. "Someone needs to stand up to her," one woman told me quietly. "Maybe this will finally do it." Over the next few days, things escalated quickly. Brenda filed a formal complaint with the county against me for illegal water discharge. The county sent out an inspector who spent about an hour examining my property and my pump setup. "Mr. Lawson, are you pumping water from your basement through pipes that discharge onto neighboring properties?" the inspector asked me directly. "I'm pumping water from my basement to prevent flooding damage," I said. "The water discharges onto my own property, and after that, it follows natural drainage patterns." The inspector walked around examining the area. He noticed my pipe system, partially hidden but not completely concealed. He followed it for a bit, then came back. "This looks like you've installed a pretty extensive drainage system," he said. "I'm protecting my property from flooding," I replied. "Is there a county code that prohibits homeowners from installing drainage systems?" "Not generally, no," the inspector admitted. "But if you're deliberately directing water onto other properties, that's a different issue. The water flows through common areas and follows natural drainage. If it ends up on someone else's property, that's because of the topography, not because of anything I'm deliberately doing." It was semantic games, but technically true. The inspector took notes and photos, but I could tell he was in a difficult position. The real problem was the HOA's drainage project, and everyone knew it. Me adding my own drainage system was a response to that problem, not the cause of it. 2 days later, I got notice that the HOA board had scheduled another meeting, this time with their attorney present. Patricia and I attended, and this time the mood was very different. The HOA attorney, a sharp-looking woman named Jennifer, started by laying out the HOA's position. "The association is willing to discuss a settlement with Mr. Lawson that addresses both his flooding issues and his unauthorized drainage modifications. However, this requires good faith negotiation from both parties." "What kind of settlement are we talking about?" Patricia asked. Jennifer slid a document across the table. "The HOA will agree to modify the stormwater drainage system to eliminate the flow onto Mr. Lawson's property. In exchange, Mr. Lawson will remove his unauthorized drainage system and sign a release of all claims against the HOA." Patricia and I reviewed the document. It was actually more reasonable than I expected, but there were problems. "This doesn't address compensation for the damage that's already occurred," Patricia pointed out. "My client has spent thousands of dollars on pumping equipment, emergency repairs, and lost property. The HOA needs to make him whole." "The HOA disputes liability for that damage," Jennifer said. "We believe Mr. Lawson's property had pre-existing drainage problems." "That's absolute nonsense," I interjected. "I lived in that house for over a year before your project started, and I never had a drop of water in my basement. You know you caused this damage. The question is whether you want to admit it now and settle reasonably, or admit it later in court after spending tens of thousands on legal fees." Brenda, who had been sitting silently, finally spoke up. "I want him to pay for the damage to my property too. My yard is ruined." "Your yard is experiencing drainage problems," I said, echoing her own words back to her. "That's what homeowner insurance is for. Remember?" Her face flushed with anger, but Jennifer put a hand on her arm to keep her quiet. "Let's focus on moving forward," Jennifer said diplomatically. "What would Mr. Lawson need to settle this matter?" Patricia and I had discussed this beforehand. "The HOA needs to fix the drainage system within 30 days, pay Mr. Lawson $15,000 for damages already incurred, and agree to cover any future remediation costs if additional problems arise from the original project. In exchange, Mr. Lawson will remove his drainage modifications and release all claims." "$15,000 is too high," Jennifer said immediately. "We negotiated for over an hour. Eventually, we settled on the HOA, fixing the drainage within 45 days, paying me $10,000 and covering up to $5,000 in future remediation costs if mold or other issues emerged from the previous flooding. I also insisted on a clause that I wouldn't be fined for any HOA violations related to this matter, including my drainage modifications." Everyone signed the settlement agreement that night. I could tell Brenda was furious about the whole thing, but she was outvoted by the other board members who just wanted the problem to go away before legal costs spiraled out of control. But here's where things got really interesting. After the meeting, Frank pulled me aside in the parking lot. "Tyler, can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked, looking around to make sure Brenda wasn't within earshot. "Sure," I said. "Look, I need to tell you something, but you didn't hear this from me," Frank said in a low voice. "The reason Brenda has been so aggressive about denying responsibility for your flooding is because she knew about the problem before the construction even finished." "What do you mean?" I asked, suddenly very interested. "The engineering firm that designed the project sent the HOA a memo during construction warning that the drainage system needed an additional retention pond to handle the water volume safely. Brenda decided not to build it because it would have cost an extra $20,000. She figured the water would just dissipate naturally and no one would notice. So she knowingly created a flooding hazard to save money?" "Exactly," Frank confirmed. "And when your property started flooding, she realized that if it got investigated, the missing retention pond would be discovered, and she'd be on the hook. That's why she's been fighting so hard to blame everything on your property having problems." "Do you have any proof of this?" I asked. "The engineering firm's memo should be in the HOA records," Frank said, "but Brenda controls access to those files. After tonight's settlement, though, I think the board is going to start asking more questions about how this project was managed." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Frank shrugged. "Because I've been on this board for 3 years, and I'm tired of Brenda running things like her personal fiefdom. What she did to your property was wrong, and her trying to cover it up is worse. People need to know what kind of person is running this HOA." After Frank left, I immediately called Patricia and told her what I had learned. She was quiet for a moment, then said something that changed everything. "If Brenda knowingly created a hazard that caused property damage and then attempted to cover it up, that could be criminal negligence," Patricia said. "At minimum, it's fraud. The settlement agreement we just signed releases the HOA from liability, but it doesn't necessarily protect Brenda individually if she committed intentional wrongdoing." "What should I do?" I asked. "For now, nothing," Patricia advised. "The settlement is good for you. You're getting your property fixed and compensation for damages. But if evidence emerges about Brenda's conduct and if other homeowners were affected, this could become a bigger issue." Over the next week, the HOA hired contractors to begin work on fixing the drainage system. The county inspector, Marcus, also started asking pointed questions about the engineering plans and why they didn't include certain retention features that were standard for a project of that size. And then, things really exploded. Another homeowner, a man named David who lived 2 houses down from me, reported that his crawl space had been flooding since the drainage project was completed. He had assumed it was just a plumbing problem and had been paying to have it pumped out. But after hearing about my situation at the HOA meeting, he realized it might be connected. David filed his own complaint with the county and the HOA. Then another homeowner came forward with similar issues, and another. Within 2 weeks, there were 6 different properties reporting flooding or drainage problems that had started after the HOA's project. The county opened a formal investigation into the drainage project and demanded that the HOA produce all engineering documents, permits, and communications related to the work. That's when the engineering firm's memo came to light, the one warning about the need for an additional retention pond. Marcus, the county inspector, called me directly. "Mr. Lawson, I wanted to give you a heads up. We've discovered that the HOA president, Brenda Donnelly, made significant changes to the approved engineering plan without proper permits or board approval. She eliminated a required retention pond to reduce costs, and she did so knowing it would create flooding risks for multiple properties." "What happens now?" I asked. "The county is referring this to the district attorney's office for possible criminal charges," Marcus said. "This goes beyond a civil matter. Multiple properties were damaged due to intentional misconduct. That's potentially criminal negligence, fraud, and filing false permit documents." I felt a mix of vindication and shock. I had wanted Brenda to be held accountable, but criminal charges were a whole different level. The investigation moved quickly after that. The district attorney's office interviewed all the affected homeowners, reviewed the engineering documents, and interviewed the contractors who had done the work. Several contractors confirmed that Brenda had personally directed them to make changes to the approved plans without notifying the county or the rest of the board. During this time, the HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted to remove Brenda as president, pending the outcome of the investigation. Frank was appointed interim president, and one of his first actions was to cooperate fully with the DA's investigation and to authorize additional settlements with the other affected homeowners. The work on fixing the drainage system was completed in early May, about 6 weeks after the settlement was signed. The contractors installed a proper retention pond, regraded the drainage channels, and disconnected the system from my property. They also fixed the issues affecting the other homeowners. The first time it rained after the repairs were done, I stood in my basement watching the floor drain. No water came up. The drain did its job normally, handling only the water from my property, and my basement stayed completely dry. It was such a relief I almost cried. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings against Brenda moved forward. In July, she was formally charged with 6 counts of criminal negligence, 3 counts of fraud, and 2 counts of filing false documents with the county. Each charge carried potential jail time and substantial fines. The case went to trial in September. I was called as a witness, along with several other homeowners, the contractors, the engineer who had written the original warning memo, and county officials. The evidence against Brenda was overwhelming. The engineer testified that he had explicitly warned Brenda in writing that eliminating the retention pond would cause flooding problems. He had recommended either building the pond as designed or significantly reducing the scope of the project. Brenda had ignored both recommendations. The contractors testified that Brenda had told them the changes were approved by the board and the county, which was a lie. She had acted unilaterally to save money, hoping no one would notice. When I took the stand, the prosecutor asked me to describe what had happened to my property and how the HOA had responded. They denied everything, I testified. Even after a plumber confirmed the flooding was from their drainage system, even after the county issued a violation notice, the HOA president refused to take responsibility. She tried to blame my property for having design flaws when the only flaw was what she had deliberately created. "And how did this affect you financially and emotionally?" the prosecutor asked. "I spent thousands of dollars on emergency repairs and equipment. I lost property that had sentimental value, including some of my late father's tools that can't be replaced, and I felt completely helpless, like this person had destroyed my home and there was nothing I could do about it because she hid behind the HOA and refused to admit what she'd done." Brenda's attorney tried to argue that she had made a good faith business decision to reduce costs and hadn't intended to cause harm. But the prosecution showed emails where Brenda had discussed the risk of flooding and had decided to proceed anyway, calculating that the HOA's insurance or individual homeowners would end up paying for any damages rather than the association. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Brenda guilty on all counts. At sentencing in November, the judge was harsh. "Ms. Donnelly, you held a position of trust within your community. Homeowners relied on you to make decisions in their best interest, and you violated that trust in the most egregious way. You knowingly created a hazard that damaged multiple properties, and then you attempted to cover up your misconduct and blame the victims. This court takes such abuse of authority very seriously." Brenda was sentenced to 18 months in jail with all but 6 months suspended, meaning she would serve 6 months and the rest would be probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution of over $60,000 to the affected homeowners, covering damages beyond what the HOA settlements had provided. Additionally, she was fined $20,000 and ordered to perform 300 hours of community service after her release. I attended the sentencing hearing along with several other affected homeowners. Watching Brenda be led away in handcuffs felt surreal. This whole nightmare had started with some flooding in my basement, and it had ended with criminal convictions and jail time. After the sentencing, Frank, who was now officially the HOA president after a special election, approached me outside the courthouse. "Tyler, I wanted to apologize on behalf of the board," he said. "What Brenda did was unconscionable, and the way she handled your complaints was even worse. We've implemented new policies to make sure nothing like this can ever happen again." "What kind of policies?" I asked. All infrastructure projects now require approval from the full board and an independent engineering review, Frank explained. We've also established a formal complaint process with mandatory timelines for investigation and response, and we're requiring full transparency on all HOA finances and contracts. Basically, no one person will ever have the kind of unilateral authority that Brenda abused. That sounds like a good start, I said. I also wanted to thank you for fighting this, Frank continued. If you had just accepted what Brenda told you and dealt with the flooding on your own, she would have gotten away with it. The other homeowners might never have realized what was happening. You standing up for yourself exposed a serious problem and made the neighborhood safer for everyone. Over the following months, life slowly returned to normal. The HOA completed additional remediation work on all the affected properties, including professional mold inspections and treatment where needed. My basement was fully restored, and I was even able to replace some of my lost property using the restitution money from Brenda's criminal case. The neighborhood dynamics changed significantly. With Brenda gone and Frank in charge, the HOA became far more reasonable and responsive. Residents who had been afraid to raise concerns or question decisions now felt empowered to participate in community governance. Several new board members were elected who were committed to transparency and accountability. As for my drainage modification system, the pipes I had installed to send water to Brenda's yard, I removed those as required by the settlement agreement. But I kept all the documentation and photos, partly as evidence, but partly as a reminder of what I had been driven to do. Looking back, I'm not proud that I resorted to vigilante justice, but I also don't regret it. Sometimes, when you're dealing with someone who abuses their power and refuses to listen to reason, you have to speak in a language they'll understand. In February, about a year after the initial flooding, I received a letter from the county. They had completed a comprehensive review of all HOA infrastructure projects in the county following the Pinecrest Meadows case. They had found several other instances where HOAs had cut corners or made unauthorized modifications that created safety hazards. The county had implemented new oversight procedures to prevent similar problems in the future. The letter thanked me for my cooperation with their investigation and noted that my case had prompted systemic changes that would protect homeowners throughout the county. It was a small consolation for everything I had been through, but it felt good to know that something positive had come from the nightmare. I also heard through the neighborhood gossip network that Brenda had lost her house. Between the criminal fines, restitution payments, and legal bills from her defense, she had been financially destroyed. Her husband had divorced her during the trial, and she had been forced to sell the house and move out of state after serving her jail sentence. I tried not to take satisfaction in her downfall, but it was hard to feel too much sympathy for someone who had caused so much damage and shown so little remorse. By the spring, Pinecrest Meadows felt like a completely different place. The HOA was running smoothly under Frank's leadership. The neighborhood looked better maintained because residents actually trusted the board to handle issues properly. And property values, which had started to decline when word got out about the drainage problems, were recovering. I even started to feel at home again. That sense of violation and helplessness that had dominated my life for those months gradually faded. My basement stayed dry through spring storms and summer downpours. The new drainage system worked exactly as it was supposed to, channeling water safely away without threatening anyone's property. In June, the other affected homeowners and I organized a neighborhood barbecue, partly to celebrate the resolution of the drainage nightmare, and partly to strengthen the sense of community that had been damaged by the whole ordeal. About 40 families showed up, including Frank and the other board members. David, whose crawl space had been flooding, raised a beer and a toast. To Tyler Lawson, who had the guts to stand up to a bully and fight for what was right. This neighborhood is better because of you. People applauded, and I felt genuinely touched. I hadn't been trying to be a hero. I'd just been trying to protect my home and my property from someone who was abusing their authority. But if my fight had made life better for other people, that meant something. As the evening went on, and I stood in my backyard, listening to neighbors laughing and kids playing, I reflected on everything that had happened. It had been one of the most stressful, expensive, and frustrating experiences of my life. I'd been pushed to the edge, driven to take actions that probably crossed legal and ethical lines. But I had also learned something important about standing up for yourself and refusing to be bullied, even by people in positions of authority. The drainage crisis had taught me that institutions and organizations, even ones designed to serve their members, could be corrupted by individuals who prioritized power and control over their actual responsibilities. HOAs were supposed to protect property values and maintain community standards, but when someone like Brenda took charge, they could become instruments of abuse. It had also taught me about the importance of documentation, persistence, and being willing to fight even when the odds seemed stacked against you. If I had given up after that first meeting with Brenda, or if I had accepted her denials and just tried to deal with the flooding on my own, she never would have faced consequences for what she did. Other homeowners would have continued suffering, and the systemic problems would have persisted. And yes, I had learned something about creative problem-solving and making a point. Rerouting water through Brenda's yard had been petty and probably illegal, but it had also been effective in getting her attention and forcing the issue. Sometimes conventional channels don't work, and you have to think outside the box, even if that box involves drainage pipes and questionable interpretations of property law. As summer turned to fall, life continued its return to normalcy. I focused on my work, I dated a little bit, and I even started volunteering on a couple of HOA committees to help implement the new transparency policies. It felt good to be part of building something better rather than just tearing down something broken. The final chapter of the saga came in October when I received my share of the restitution money from Brenda's criminal case. It was about $8,000, on top of the $10,000 from the civil settlement. I used some of it to replace my father's tools with similar vintage models I found online. They weren't the same ones, with their history and memories, but they were close enough. The rest went into an emergency fund, because if I had learned anything, it was that unexpected disasters could strike at any time, and you needed to be prepared. On the anniversary of that first flooding incident, I went down to my basement and just looked around. The space was completely restored now, dry and functional, with new storage systems and fresh paint. There was no trace of the nightmare that had consumed my life a year earlier, but I would never forget what had happened or the lessons I had learned. I thought about Brenda sometimes, wondering where she was and what she was doing with her life after everything fell apart. I hoped she had learned something from the experience, that she understood the real harm she had caused and why her actions had been so wrong. But I also knew that some people never truly accept responsibility for their mistakes. They just blame others and play the victim, even when they're the ones who created the problem. As for me, I was done with vigilante justice and creative water routing solutions. I had proven my point, won my case, and helped create positive change in my community. That was enough. I could finally move on with my life, secure in my home and confident that I could handle whatever challenges came next. Because if I could survive a corrupt HOA president, flooding basements, legal battles, and the whole surreal experience of fighting back against someone who thought they were untouchable, I could handle just about anything. The basement stayed dry through the winter, through the spring storms, through everything. The nightmare was truly over, replaced by the simple, ordinary blessing of a home that stayed dry and safe. And every time it rained, every time I heard thunder and knew the storm drains were doing their job properly, I felt grateful for the fight I had fought and the victory I had won. It wasn't the fresh start I had imagined when I bought my house in Pinecrest Meadows. It was something harder earned and more valuable. It was the knowledge that I could stand up for myself, that I could fight back against injustice even when it seemed hopeless, and that sometimes the system actually worked, even if it took a lot of pushing to make it happen. The water flowed where it was supposed to now, safely away from everyone's homes, managed by proper infrastructure that protected the whole community. And that was exactly how it should have been from the beginning. All it took was one person refusing to accept an injustice, and a neighborhood full of people willing to support each other and demand accountability from those in power. In the end, that's what made a community strong. Not the rules enforced by the HOA, not the perfectly maintained lawns and matching mailboxes, but the willingness of ordinary people to stand up for what was right and to hold their leaders accountable when they went wrong. Brenda had forgotten that basic truth, and it had cost her everything. The rest of us had learned it, and Pinecrest Meadows was better for it. And my basement stayed dry year after year, exactly as it should.